The meaning of British, or indeed any national literature, isn't stable at all. Such terms are always contested, both from within and without. And in Britain's case, the idea of British is always challenged, undermined by the multinational makeup of the British Isles. Welsh literature, Scottish literature, the literature of Northern Ireland. For the different volumes in the series, editors have taken different approaches because over the course of the 20th century, the various national and global dimensions of Britishness come in and out of focus. So the first volume is concerned with issues of empire and a lot of exiled and émigré writers. When we get on to the second volume, the volume covering 1920 to 1940, the editors have a section called The First Breakup of Britain, which is a very stimulating discussion of the surge of national sentiment in writing, so Welsh writing, Scottish writing, writing from Northern Ireland. But when I came to think about the next volume, volume 3, which covers 1940 to 1960, it was a very different situation. These are the years of the Second World War, and there's a sort of temporary, rather fragile homogeneity to literature in Britain in that period. There's a damping down of national literatures and people coming together willingly, unwillingly, to think about Britain in different ways. When we get to 1960, we find the editor thinking much more about the regional and about how northern writing from all across the various component parts of England, Scotland and Wales, not just the national blocks, is refracted through literary practice, particularly in poetry. And then when we get to the final volume, 1980 to 2000, we come to the second breakup of Britain and the literature of devolution. And also in this period, obviously, the global is becoming a factor. We find the editors and their contributors asking, is national still a functional term for thinking through literature? And the answer is sometimes no. And running through the whole century, we have the question of exactly what constitutes British citizenship. Who or what is a British writer? We have the literature of immigration. We have the literature of exile. We have writers who want to belong to Britain, writers who would frankly rather not. And so it's a complicated and diverse picture. Well, the 20th century is a period of immense socio-political change, huge events, world wars, decolonisation. So literature has a complicated role to play with this, both reflecting and interacting with these changes as they happen. And literature is one of the ways in which people make sense of the world. Literature organises events, particularly fiction. It narrativizes. It helps people get a hold on things that feel beyond their comprehension. It also creates a space for emotional reaction and interaction. Poetry has long been seen as a way through which people mediate grief and manage traumatic emotions. So literature is an emotive space, an affective space, but it is also a confrontational space, a space through which writers seek to engage audiences and engage the politics of the time. It's also the case, though, that literature doesn't and cannot always respond directly to current events. It's not journalism. It's not a kind of newspaper. Literature is also reflection in aftermath, the post hoc ordering of events. And this means that literary form sometimes changes in curious and unexpected ways. And again, the Second World War provides us with some interesting examples. Elizabeth Bowen, quite a well-known novelist, she wasn't alone in finding total war inimical to writing. She found it impossible to write her novel during the war years. So she wrote short stories instead. And her short stories are some of the most remarkable literature to come out of the conflict. Snapshots, photographs, fragments that give some idea of what it was like to survive bombing, living in the strangely denuded, stressed, exhausting world of the Second World War. So, yes, form changes, literary form changes, as well as literature telling us about the world that we're living in. It's important to think about the canon because, particularly in the 20th century, I think we're still working with a very limited idea of what the canon is. I'm thinking particularly here of high modernism. It's still the case that in schools and universities there are a very small number of privileged writers, Eliot, Woolf, Joyce, who overshadow the century. And we need to keep on rethinking and reappraising canons in order better to understand what mattered and what was valued at the time. The crucial thing is a lot of the writers that we're bringing back into focus in this series weren't just popular when they were writing, they were critically respected. People thought they were important then. So we need to ask why they've been forgotten and to understand what happened that made some people become part of a concrete, important canon and why other people simply disappeared, particularly since there's a lot to enjoy and to be interested in these writers, and reading them alongside the famous names helps us get a better idea of both. So that's an important reason. It's also important because canons are retrospective. They're formed out of a set of prejudices and ideas of the people making the selection, making the choices. And over the course of the 20th century, canons have been quite problematic. For example, for a long time the canon completely forgot about women. And women writers have been crucial to the 20th century. For a long time, even Virginia Woolf struggled to be accepted as an important writer. But you might take examples like Stevie Smith, the poet. She was recognised at points in her career. She won the Queen's Gold Medal for poetry. But then she disappeared. I think perhaps because she's an unusual writer. She doesn't fit any of the conventional categories. And so because she doesn't fit, she gets forgotten. Another problematic example might be someone like Agatha Christie. Nobody's in any danger of forgetting Agatha Christie. She was almost too famous. And because she is such a famous figure, people don't recognise that when she's writing in the 20s and the 30s, she's actually a literary innovator. She's changing the forms and the functions of literature, and she's doing quite radical things. She too is a modernist of sorts. The idea throughout is to challenge canons and to complicate them, to restore the diversity to the literary picture of the 20th century.